And we're live. Hello, good afternoon. I am Ricardo Faguara. I am, chair of the social media task force of the World Council of Anthropological Associations, and I'm also the communications officer of the World Anthropological Union. It is a pleasure to present you with this conversation that is uh, leading us or helping us to reach our goal to be in the international UAS Congress that is going to be online, but in this occasion, Yucatan is going to be in charge of all the organization and all the media. In this occasion, I have the pleasure to introduce you to great scholars who actually are involved in how do we write anthropology. And for that reason, we named this conversation Writing Anthropology. So for me, it's a pleasure to introduce Carole McGranahan. She's a professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado. She's author of Arrested Histories, Tibet, the CIA, and Histories of a Forgotten War, and editor most recently of Flash Anthropology with Naomi Stone. That's in 2020. And if you are using us in social media, especially Facebook, you're going to see that there's all the links for her publications. She also wrote Writing Anthropology, Essays on Craft and Commitment. She's currently writing a book titled Theoretical Storytelling, Ethnography as a Way of Knowing. I also have the pleasure of introducing Raul PachecoVega. He's an assistant professor in the Methods Lab of the Latin American Faculty for Social Sciences. For those in Spanish, is la Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales Flaxo, that is here in Mexico City. He's a specialist in comparative public policy and focuses on North American environmental politics, primarily sanitation and water governance, solid waste management, new institutional theory, transnational environment, social movements, and experimental methods in public policy. He's a member of the Mexican National Researcher System, we know it as ESNI, and holds a distinction of National Researcher Level 1. I also want to add that Raul PachecoVega has a wonderful blog, about all things about writing, qualitative and quantitative papers. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation to talk about your own experience and your scholarly expertise. So I would like to start, like everyone knows that this is a space among friends, among colleagues. So what's the thing about writing anthropology? For example, I was trained as an anthropology like 20 years ago, and we had a specific way of writing things, like ethnographies. So probably my main question, like both that are in the field and are constantly, thinking about it, like, what's the thing about writing ethnography, not anthropology? And then probably we can discuss that. So please, this is your virtual space.
Sure. Raul, do you want to start, or would you like me
to? There you go. Yes, thank you, Carole.
Okay, that's a great question, actually, because ethnography as method, as theory, as writing, right, is not stable and has absolutely changed over the decades. So when I think of the ethnographies, right, that I read when I was a student at university, they differed from the ones I read later, a decade later as a graduate student, to the ones I write now as a professor. And part of that is our shifting understanding of what writing can do. I think initially writing was, or not initially, but at certain points in academia, writing has been thought of as a vehicle to communicate our, research results. So it has this very instrumental purpose. And right now, that is absolutely not the moment we're in, right? We're in a moment now where actually writing itself matters, not just as a vehicle, but rather matters as part of the argument we're making, right? And as part of our way of knowing. And so I think it's a shift in thinking about ethnography, right, as much as thinking about writing. That writing also, I guess the other thing I would add in just right up front is audience. And so who it is we're writing for. And again, those articles and books maybe that I read 20, 30 years ago, I think the presumed audience for most of those were other scholars, for students in classes and for your fellow professors. Now when I write, and I think when many of my colleagues write, we imagine not just say a generic public audience, but we also imagine readers who are the community with whom we're doing our research. You know, for me, that's often the first readers I imagine, and my colleagues and students are actually second or right there alongside of them. So it's kind of these, I would put that up there as well, just that is actually a major shift that I don't think we've marked enough or kind of talked about enough, right, in the academy, at least for ethnography.
I'd love to follow up on Carole's, because as I was preparing for this conversation, I was taking notes of one of the most interesting books on ethnographic methods that I've read, and it was edited by Miriam Burry and Ravi Shukla. It's called it's on hidden populations, and I think I need to remember the title. I have it here downstairs in my house, but they say, and I quote, "Ethnographic convention and styles change over time, and authoritative statements of what constitutes ethnographic research are ephemeral." And they're completely right, and that is completely what Carole is saying, right? Like what we understand as ethnography is change, and the way I was trained, and I'm a multidisciplinary scholar, right? I was originally a chemical engineer. I have a master's in economics. My PhD is a double PhD in political science and human geography, and I learned ethnography during grad school, right? Like during my doctorate. And I learned it from social workers and from nurses. So this is sort of this very, but I am in the written space with sociologists and anthropologists who use ethnography a lot. And then my writing now is being used to teach ethnography. And so this is sort of this sort of dynamic approach that Carole is saying really transforms the way in which I think now as ethnography, right? Like I now think of ethnography as the instrument that I live, breathe, and yes, I do mixed methods and I run field experiments and I run regressions, but I feel this immediate connection to ethnography. And that actually brings me, and maybe Carole can expand on this, to one of the concepts that Carole has actually written about a lot, which is the ethnographic sensibility. This way of looking at the world that just makes sense to understand the world and to make sense of the world. And I would just like to read one sentence from a memo that I'm writing on studying homelessness ethnographically, because as I wrote the memo, it really made me think, and I quote, "Few things make me feel as much physical and emotional pain as witnessing poverty." And this is sort of the introductory sentence to my memo, and it's very raw, because that's how I feel. That's how I feel when I do ethnography of homeless people. So anyway, it's dynamic and it helps us understand, and I would argue it also helps us explain to the world what we're understanding, right? Like bringing them along on the ride.
I have a question for, well, I have many questions, of course. I'm not an expert in the topic, but what you were saying, for example, and something that Carole mentioned, and also Raul, and I'm going to emphasize this about Raul because he's on Twitter quite often, and he push us, how to organize our things. That's what I mentioned his blog. But one of the many things, for example, when we learn where we are undergrads or we are grad students, especially in the social sciences, like those who do field work, is that most of the time we read, for example, classics. I say like, oh, you should do this. But some things that I learned from my own experience is that, writing is not the translation of, like, for example, a classic is not a translation of how we should do the field work. And on the other side is like, we need to find our own voice at some point. Like things or things that I have been reading lately is like saying like, well, this is how they wrote things back in the 30s or in the 40s, like very classic ethnography. And especially I think about, for example, Mexico, that's where I am here right now. But for example, there's another tradition, for example, in the United States, and there's another tradition in I'm going to say the British school France has a completely different perspective of things. But what do you think? Like, I don't want to call it like, like the writing turn as the archival turn or the ontological turn, but I'm seeing a lot of people interested, for example, even with the advent, or now that a lot of scholars are using autoethnography, like how to find a personal voice, how to shape a different narrative for people who are not actually, how can we say it, like engaged directly with the discipline. And the discipline can be, anthropology or sociology or even literature, for example, that they have extremely interesting narratives that actually, like fit perfectly with the ethnographic or the anthropological writing. So they took too much time in elaborating.
No, I think one thing that really makes ethnographic writing different, kind of in speaking to the way you were talking about, Ricardo, and this is, in some ways, it holds constant across different national traditions of scholarship, because you're right. It's not just we're writing in different languages, but there's also just different approaches that are, located in different countries. But one thing about ethnography that makes the writing, for example, perhaps more livelier than, say, certain types of qualitative, right, scholarship, never mind quantitative, is that ethnographic research involves immersing yourself in a world with people about whom you come to care, about whom you need to develop relationships of trust with, of vulnerability. And then you end up writing, right, about people actual people, right? Not hypothetical people, not anonymous individuals who filled out a survey, right? But you're writing about someone who is either in the next room or whose face appears before you, about with whom you have a relationship. And that quality, right, of ethnographic research has been brought forward in our research. I would say since, we might not want to talk too much about turns, but I would mark the 1980s, right, as a real turning point, at least in anthropology, but also in cognate fields doing ethnography, in terms of how we write, where we start writing about people like with names, rather than just using categories to refer to them, like, the priest, the baker, the sister-in-law. But instead we start giving them, we refer to them by names. They might be pseudonyms, but we still, by naming them, and not categorizing them, we humanize them in a way that ends up really changing the sort of writing we do, right? And what it is we want to say about people, and not just about, say, communities or cultures. And I think that actually, it's been 40 years now, 50 years even, 50, 40, it depends where we're marking it from. But that has really increasingly over the decades, right? And initially it was referred to as experimental writing, at least in anthropology. And now it's the heart, right, of ethnographic writing, such that experimental writing would be something that doesn't involve people, right? That's not narrative, that's not bringing forth lived experience. But it's really become the heart of what we do, is this centering in relationships with real people and their experiences in the world.
Yeah. And what I think also becomes important is in creating those spaces and writing about those people and relationships, we need to also be careful. And this is also part of what you were saying about this turn. We need to be careful to lift their voices rather than, become their voices, right? Like this is the very subtle sort of turn as well in how we write ethnography, right? Like is it me seeing you seeing the world, or is it how you see the world and how I see that you see the world? So this is sort of it's very dynamic. And I found it very interesting because doing ethnography in different languages is completely unreal, completely. And not only, I did ethnography in France 2 years ago when I was doing my sabbatical, and it's completely unreal to change the language. But even if you're just in one language, it really, how you write about it and how you write it in translation as well. I've noticed that it becomes really, really hard to translate. And the ironic thing is, in some ways, and I see anthropology as, the discipline of the gaze, right? Like, there's always these, observation of exotic cultures and so on. And then I think, well, what if you missed something in your observation, right? Like if you're doing, and I've lately been reading a lot of ethnographies, hospital ethnographies in Tanzania, the work of, Adrian Green. I'll have to check, but it's sort of these. Are you actually writing what the community is telling you, what the people, these very in-depth relationships are telling you? So I think the translation also is important, and we've changed how we do it. So now, and this also relates to language competency. I think ethnography also requires that degree of language competency that other disciplines just give themselves, the benefit of, well, not all of them, of course. I mean, history requires you. My ex-boyfriend used to be a historian. Is a historian of Japanese history. He spoke Japanese, like he's Canadian as they come, but he spoke Japanese, and he spoke Japanese, perfect Japanese, because that was demanded of him. And political scientists also require, and I know that anthropologists also require the language in many disciplines, but others just give themselves this, or maybe groups of scholars, but just they give themselves this, laissez-faire approach that I don't think anthropologists would get a pass, right? Like I think anthropologists need this very strong commitment to really having the language.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in anthropology. So actually, I have a PhD in history as well as anthropology. I don't know if you knew that, Raul. So I'm a historian as well as an anthropologist. And you're right. In both fields, mastery of language, whether it's an archival language, textual, scriptural, or oral language, spoken language is absolutely essential. And that's like not even open to question. Right, Ricardo, you're probably like, yes, right? Like you have to be able to speak the language of the community. You cannot work with a translator. Maybe in the beginning when you're just getting started and you're still learning a language, but that would not be considered an acceptable method, right? The reliance on a translator for research. And that, of course, right, then means that you're writing often, as I do, writing about research I've conducted in the Tibetan language, or sometimes the Nepali language. I'm writing about it in English.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's more complicated. Well, it's glad to know that you're also a historian. Yeah, me too. Well, yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, like I'm glad that we have like different perspectives from the social sciences.
I'm a closet historian, and this semester I'm actually co-teaching a historical methods class with Dr. Mike Best from CDMX Mexico and Dr. Juliet Levy from the University of California, Riverside. Both of them are actually trained historians, but
exactly,
I'm a historian. I love history.
But there's an advantage that you say, Raul. For example, Mike is a specialist in infrastructure, and Juliet, she's an economic historian, and she's also very good in judicial protocols. But anyway, that's things about the archive, and actually that's where I want to go. Well, just for a little bit, because, for example, you, Carole, were mentioning, yes, like we're naming, we're giving names to people, and even ourselves, we're introducing our own emotions to the narrative when we're writing, and I think it's absolutely correct. No, instead of seeing, for example, a narrative that everything is too hygienic, like everything, everyone, and everything should fit. How certain theoretical or hypothetical schemes work. Now we're using, certain shifts just because of emotions or certain things that happen at some moment. But what both of you think, for example, about like these ethnographic approaches, like becoming also a part of the archive, like a place where a lot of different elements, not only the administrative state, things should go, like it can be like an archive of emotions or an archive of different concepts also defined by their own people. So what do you think about that? Like both of you have archival experience. Well, most of anthropologists at least do at some point. So what do you think, for example, like the archive helping this narrative, and how do you approach this? That's a different.
It's a good question. It's a good question. So Carole may have another position, but I've done ethnographic work where a number of the things that I ask and the things that I observe need external confirmation. So I use archival work to triangulate. This is very common in mixed methods. So even in qualitative methods, right? Like triangulating different sources of information. So so I see the archive and the archival term as sort of the very, very much a triangulation strategy. But so this takes me to something that I wanted to ask Carole what she thought about, because I said in a talk, and I think people just got a heart attack when I said, well, I'm sort of an ethnographer who is also a positivist, right? Like, I believe that there is a reality and I can observe it by immersing myself in the field and in a culture and so on. And people just went ballistic because they thought that there was no way ethnography could be positivist. And I was like, I don't know. I'm starting to have my own doubts. So anyway, we can talk about that. But yeah, that's a question I have as well. Is ethnography, positivistic, or will it continue to be interpretivist? So where do we draw the line? But yeah, that's just for Carole. Maybe I'll ask you about that later. But yeah, on the archival, you can go ahead.
Okay, that's now I have two very different and equally fascinating questions before me. Before coming to positivism, I'm going to hold that. Let's talk about the archive for a minute. Because I think there are ways in which you can use an archive for triangulation, as you were saying, Raul, or sometimes even for I think many anthropologists who go into the archives just for like a day or two, right? Like they're going to extract some sort of information. That's not how I was trained. And so I actually want to share my approach to the archives is different. I do what's called ethnography in the archives, right? So it's reading the archives ethnographically. So we're back actually to the question of an ethnographic sensibility, right? What does it mean to approach a collection of documents as something, right, created by humans, and to try and pull, right, the human emotion, the affect you're talking about, Ricardo, but also those cultural logics and rhythms, right? Like that sense of the system that generated these particular conversations, right? Like what is the work that these documents are doing? What are the comments? One of my favorite thing is often, I look at, so I work in the British archives, British colonial archives for Tibet. And you can see the correspondence back and forth between different colonial officials. And then they write on the side, write notes to each other. And you come to know after a while the handwriting, and you can recognize the handwriting of different officials. And you can anticipate sometimes what they're going to say in probably a way somewhat similar to how their colleagues knew, oh, so-and-so is going to respond this way, right? And that's trying to get to that ethnographic space, right? That we presume ethnography requires an in-person relationship, but ethnography in the archives allows us to kind of approximate that. And to just throw this out there, so too does ethnography on social media, right? So when you're actually doing ethnographic research on social media that's not with data sets, right, of downloading thousands of tweets, right, or any social media platform that is, but when you're actually like reading tweets and in relationships with people, right, you can still get to that same sort of ethnographic space. Right. So I think for me, the archive is in some ways about understanding it as an affective cultural, right, domain of politics and, production, right, of whatever it is that's happening in that, that place at the time. And actually some of my favorite articles that I've ever written are ones where I'm putting ethnographic data from in-person research in dialogue with ethnographic data from the archives. Right, and kind of like using those to comment on each other in interesting and unexpected ways.
That's very nice.
I hope so.
No, because I'm also reflecting in my own, for example, I haven't done field work like in 20 years. I have done in the last 20 years more archival research. But for example, in this turn, for example, of thinking, although I work the same region, different period, one thing is 18th century, and the other thing is like doing, indigenous or peasant markets, or how does things move around, because my bachelor's and master's were technically same topic, different time period. But I never thought about like in person, what people told me, what I was able to see, with what I actually learned from the archive. So that's going to be something pending. So, sorry, Raul, you wanted to say something.
Yes, Carole saying completely resonates with what Biela Coleman from McGill said a couple of weeks ago. We had the methodological conversations. Flexo. She said something to the extent of, you are observing the interactions in between the tweets, right? Like if you do, ethnography, like digital ethnography or ethnography, you are observing those interactions, and that replicates the dynamic, that creates the ethnographic space. That process can be replicated, and I hadn't thought about it, but yes, it can be replicated. I assume people will read my index cards and they will see how my thinking was operating, right? Like, and in a way, that can also be done with my blog. And I think that's part of what makes people read my blog, because they can see and they can perceive my writing style as presenting a particular human approach to academia that I think resonates with people, right? So they come back to it, and they come back to my writing, not only for the technique, but also for what's inherent in what I write, right? Like what's inherent is I'm not writing, to make people work 8 hours a day and writing and sit down in their desk, but to make them think about the way they approach the writing process. So that's what I was thinking.
I think I'm back now. Raul, I cut out there for a little while, so I didn't hear everything you said. I just want to throw out one thing in response to the initial comments you were making from Biela. So I didn't hear that conversation, but I know Biela and her work and respect it greatly. And I think she's a wonderful example of someone who shows actually how ethnography, even online, though, can't just be observational. Right? I feel like sometimes I read articles of what's supposed to be digital ethnography, but it's clear that the scholar doesn't understand the platform, like because they don't use it. Right? And there's that participant part of observation that has to be there, right? If you're observing someone using, whether it's Instagram or Pinterest or Facebook, but you yourself don't use it, right? Like right there, you don't understand the logic of the system, right? You're just looking at the things people are posting, right? So that's, and again, I apologize, I missed the second half of it, but just adding that in, that the observation just has to be paired with some degree of participation in whatever makes sense, right? In this, and Biela shows that so well in her research through her conversations, right? That she's having, for example, with hackers in Anonymous.
Absolutely, and actually, you're completely right. What I said was exactly similar along the lines of what you said, but I think you brought one element that I think people forget, particularly when they want to do ethnography of Twitter. You have to be a user. You have to have knowledge of the system, right? And this brings me to the, it's very Goffmanian, but sort of being immersed in the actual life. And I haven't lived, for example, Joshua Oshas Reno did an ethnography of landfills and waste picking by becoming a landfill worker. And that's fascinating. And one of the best ethnographies I've read as well is by Robin Nagel from New York University, from NYU. And she became a sanitation worker. Literally, like she drove the sanitation bus. So this is sort of taking this competency in the system to the extreme. And becoming, and that also takes me to. Sorry, Carole. I think I'm posing more questions than answering. But how do we feel about becoming? Right? Like I don't know. I don't think I could, and I probably might have to. Since I'm moving a little bit more into the space of homelessness policy, I mean, I would need to experience it. And I've experienced other forms of insecurity, right? Like insecurity in access to water, insecurity in access to toilets, and insecurity in access to food. And I write about all those things, and I've written ethnographically about those things, but I have never experienced housing insecurity in that way. So I think, if I were to really understand it, I would need to probably live it and write about it from a more legitimate point. I don't know. What do you think? Sorry, I posed the question.
No. I mean, part of this actually strikes me in some ways as one of the ways I might differentiate sociology and anthropology to undergraduates, right? Is that sociology is compared with social problems and anthropology is more focused on cultural worlds. Because both of the examples you gave are very occupational driven, right? Landfill worker, sanitation worker, and anthropology tends to be a bit broader than that. So for example, I couldn't become a Tibetan guerrilla soldier, for example, right? Just to give example of the group that I wrote my book about. However, I did immerse myself in the world in which the veterans live now, right? Without, of course, becoming Tibetan or becoming a veteran. So I think the question of what immersion looks like, right, depends on the project you're doing. And for some projects, it is more, possible. If you're doing a study with, I don't know, heart surgeons, you can't pose as a heart surgeon, right, unless you have an MD saying you are qualified to do this. So I guess it's a question of how do you immerse in a sufficiently substantive way, right, to get you to that level of ethnographic knowing. And sometimes it might be possible, right, like if I want to do an ethnography of school bus drivers, it would probably be relatively easy for me to get that training. But I can't be I can't become an oncologist, with a 1-month training course, for example. So again, what qualities of immersion would be sufficient to give us the type of ethnographic depth we need to make knowledge claims ethnographically?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the depth part is also super important, right? Like, there's now this new approach, and I really like it, the rapid ethnographic assessment. And I think some people would want to get into rapid ethnographic assessment. And I just want to throw that into the mix, right? Like, I did this. I have to confess, I did rapid ethnographic assessment with my water conflicts project. Literally, we were like, I called them blitzkrieg ethnographies. And I went into the field for a week with my research assistants and my thesis students, and then we just immersed ourselves like completely in the way in which in the community that was fighting a water conflict. And then we came out and reflected and wrote about it and wrote memos and so on. And then we went in. So I don't know, how do you feel about these rapid ethnographic assessments? These, what I call them, the blitzkrieg ethnography. So I don't know.
Yeah, blitzkrieg.
It's just, yeah.
I think it depends. Again, I mean, the question of depth, of course, is going to be immediately raised. And it actually reminds me of the Flash ethnography project that I have been involved in this past year is about writing short pieces. And it's about writing, but it might also be something that we transfer to thinking about method, right? Like what sort of research is possible stepping into a community, let's say on a Wednesday, and exiting the following Wednesday, right? And literally 1 week coming to know the community, doing the research, and then leaving in that span. I think outside of academia, people have done this for a long time, right? Corporate anthropologists, or even UX researchers, right? So who have, whether they work for a corporation or are hired by one, do these much shorter term projects. And there, I think I'm going to be honest, troubling, right, for some academics is the lack of commitment to community, right? That lack of building up the trust and the relationships that I was talking about before. Your commitment is to who's hired you. Now, what you're talking about, Raul, though, is something different, right? It's not necessarily being hired by Intel to, I don't know, study something about computers over a week. but to just making something up, working with a community group over a week, right? So there's no corporation involved. And perhaps, there truly is some, I still kind of almost want to frame it as preliminary though, work that could be done within a 1 week period. I think much of it would rest on what prior knowledge you have, as well as who your group is that is stepping in. So for example, if the two of you showed up, say, in Kathmandu tomorrow, to meet some of the Tibetan families and friends with whom I work, I'm not sure how much you could accomplish in 1 week, right? Or if I showed up in Mexico City tomorrow, as lovely as that sounds, I don't know what I could do in it, right? So it's like, what would be the parameters that would make a project like that successful? And I think setting up the questions that it is you hope to ask. And of course, for us, the questions really can't be predetermined, right? Like, you can have an idea, right? But they have to emerge also from that dialogic process of being there, right? Of being in conversation and of listening. So rapid ethnographic assessment, I think, works best when there's already some sort of ethnographic relationship or knowledge that you can draw upon, such that when you appear before a community, either they already know you or they recognize you in some way that's meaningful.
Yeah, because I was gonna say, well, I never have done it. No, I learned about it, like later in my training, for example. But I really like, like rapid ethnographic assessment, the blitzkrieg of ethnography, especially for specific topics. Like right now, like the pandemic. Like things that you need to go there and solve. And I'm going to underline that word, that solve a specific problem that needs an answer. But there's too many variables and we don't know what's going to happen. But of course, as you mentioned, Carole, like we need the context, the background, to be immersed at some point or at some level. So first, let me just share a couple of comments here. Manuel Ferreira says hello from Brazil. And I'm going to share this comment from Aline Rochedo. She's also from Brazil, and here's a message from Carole, that she's she wants to thank you, for that you helped her a lot.
Thank you for reading. I'm pleased to hear that, and I see that the word finish. So congratulations on finishing writing the dissertation. That's wonderful.
Exactly. Everyone says it. A finished dissertation is a great dissertation. But let me go back. Like we're going through the ethnography and fieldwork, but let's focus, like in the much more of the writing, because sometimes, like and both of you have this experience, especially when teaching, and the expertise is like a lot of people when writing, they have to confront their fear or their fears, like saying like, now I have to write something. And this is not about a paper. This is not about a dissertation. It's like, you have to write something. And I, of course, from experience, that there's like the different audiences and also different formats. It's not one thing writing a tweet or writing on Facebook or writing on a blog or writing a very short piece, with a lot of description or going, like, what's the main point of what you want to write? Both of you have this experience, and of course you share. I don't know, like both of you have this expertise of, hearing and listening different groups of scholars of saying like, this is how things are going on with writing, specifically in anthropology in this case, or the social sciences. But I like to think about specifically in anthropology. What both of you can tell us about it?
Raul, why don't you start?
Sure. I think when I talk to people about writing, and particularly writing ethnography, and I'm not an anthropologist, as you know, but I have discourse and I converse with anthropologists and I read a lot of anthropology. And what I tell them to overcome the fear is, and this is a commercial also for Carole, read stuff that inspires you. And this is super important, right? Like something that makes you just go, okay, I can do this, right? Like, somebody else has felt the same fear and I can get it done. And I tell this to my students, right? Like I was afraid, and I've published a lot, but I was afraid. I've always been afraid of getting my work rejected, and I think the best way in which you can overcome this fear is just two things. One, and I tell my students, think about what what you're doing, right? Like, why are you writing this ethnography? Who are you giving voice to? Whose voices are you lifting? Whose stories are you telling? And then after that, look for inspiration. And I know a lot of very inspirational writers, right? Like I commented on the work of Robin, and I read Carole's writing on a regular basis, and Miriam Berry and Ravi Shukla, and I can tell you a number of people that I read just to know, okay, I can do this, right? I've read Biela, and on Friday I'm having a conversation with Forrest Stewart, who is actually a sociologist rather than an anthropologist. But it's just I think reading improves our writing, and I always say it. Carole, you've read my blog. Reading is writing. I keep bugging people about this, but yes, reading is writing, and I think it's an important component of writing anthropology. Reading other ethnographies will make people, be more willing to, and able to overcome their fear. I don't know. What do you think, Carole?
No, I agree entirely. So in many ways, this is why, actually, I have the book here too. This book even exists, right? Is because of my own, in some ways, fears of writing and my efforts to address them. So for those of you at home, the subtitle of this book, so it's called Writing Anthropology, Essays on Craft and Commitment. But actually, there should be a third C. So it should be craft, commitment, and community. So let me explain that, because I think this actually, for me, is really the answer to fear. First is the craft part. Like, writing is hard, right? You need to work at it. And it's not something that you ever finally be like, okay, I'm good, I'm done. I don't need to practice anymore, right? Like, writing is a kind of a muscle, that you need to develop. And the more you do, the better you get. But writing is not just, writing with a pen or typing. It's also reading. It's also stepping away from the laptop or the notepad sometimes to think, right? Sometimes, and to kind of know yourself, like, where do you do your best thinking? Sometimes for me, it's while I'm running, or sometimes I'm in the car, or who knows where it is, when actually a thought comes to me. It's not always when I'm in front of the computer. So I think recognizing writing spaces, editing also, right, as a component of writing. But so thinking of it as something to work on, to develop. So that's the first part. I think commitment for getting over fear matters. People tell us their stories, not just because they want us to hear them, but tell them to us because they know we're going to write about them. And often they take that very seriously, right? The promise that you as a scholar are making to someone to tell their story to the world. So honoring that commitment, right, I think is actually really, really crucial. And then the last thing, community. So actually this book that Raul and I have each held up, is not just, it's edited by me, but the contributors, there are many of them, and they're from around the world. There's over 50 authors in this book. And the book came about because I had written tons. I had already written a book, but I still was, I was hungry to talk about writing and to learn from other people, to learn about other people's fears and how they dealt with them and what ideas they had and what we could create together. So I invited other scholars to start writing about writing, basically. The prompt that I gave to everyone I invited to participate in this initial project was to write something about writing. That's how basic it was. And everyone responded, right, in their own way, in what they were thinking about, like what was on their mind in relationship to their own thoughts on writing. And I can't tell you, how grateful I was that I overcame my own hesitations to put this out openly, right, and to invite people into the conversation. So I would say find your community, right, even if it's people you don't know. I reached out for this book to people I had never met before, but who I wanted to know, or who I thought had something to say. It's like, so really the community part of writing also, I think, is something that helps you get over fear. Learning how to talk about your writing, learning how to give people feedback, learning how to receive feedback, even and especially right when it's critical. That's how we advance often our thinking on paper. So I think all of that. But acknowledging it, perhaps, Ricardo, is the first thing to do, to just say, okay, writing's hard. So now that's out of the way. Now let's see what we can do, right?
And I wanted to follow up on Carole's point on community, because I am part of writing groups right now. And this is interesting because I always wanted that community. And it's the online space that has made it possible, not the offline space. I did Shut Up and Write when I was a professor at CIDE before. I'm now an associate professor. When I was an assistant and I was at CIDE, I organized Shut Up and Write. And I did so in search of community, and it didn't gel. But online, it has. And I belong to two. One is organized by Dr. Amanda Bittner from Memorial University of Newfoundland. She's Canadian. She's a really good friend of mine from grad school, and it's fantastic. It's 9 to 11 Eastern Standard Time, and there's a lot of really wonderful. It has a very feminist approach. Like, the philosophy underlying is a feminist approach to writing and to research. And another feminist group that I write with is by Dr. Mira Holman from Tulane University on Fridays from 2 to 5 Central Time. And it's spectacular. It's been amazing for my writing. And then now I open my own writing space, my 4:30 to 6:30 in the morning. I have it on Zoom, and people join from different parts of the world for the same reason, right? And
Nice.
For a lot of people in Europe, the time that I write, that is absolutely impossible for people in normal times, like in America, in the continent of America. It's perfect for people in Europe, or so they join my Zoom writing, and it's just that community and that saying, because people, they have this perception, and I used to have that same perception from Carole until I read this, because I thought, oh, you're never afraid. Like, you write, and you write so beautifully, and I've read your work, and it's just so engaging. And then you write about this and fears and roadblocks and so on. And I was like, well, Carole is human. She also fears, when she's writing. But people have the same feeling on Twitter, right? Like, they think that I just crank out articles and book chapters and books like there's no tomorrow. And I'm like, no, like, there are entire weeks when my brain just doesn't write a sentence. So, this honesty, this raw honesty, I think is also so empowering when you write ethnography, because you know that your fear is sort of at the same time a roadblock, but also it can empower you to tell other people's stories.
I like both. Well, I was gonna say, like, at some point I felt that I was projecting myself, but I was saying about writing, and actually I need to write a couple of things for next month, but that's another story. But for example, both of you, well, actually the three of us, I think, like, for those people who are listening, for example, from Latin America, there is this thing that I think that Raul also saw when he was studying his PhD, and of course Carole, I think. In certain university, public or private, there are workshops, intense workshops exclusively about writing. Like, we know you know how to write, but we actually want to shape you, and we're going to give you ideas and how to do great spelling. And it's kind of like the, how do you say, experimental writing workshops that I actually like, the ones from poetry, the very few that I have attended. And one of the other things, and this is a perspective from Mexico, and probably a perspective from myself, because sometimes the writing experience, it is thought to be, a lonely process. Like, you go into your room, like half dark, with the computer, and you write, and you have your coffee. Some other people say, like, your wine, and you're alone with your own world, tormenting and writing. And when both of you, what I I'm learning from your own experience and also from mine, is like saying like, look, people is going to be there. Of course, people are going to criticize you, but in a very, like timely community way. So this is only just a perspective from, for example, from my experience from Mexico, of course. Well, in the US and Canada is completely different. But what I think, for example, from friends on Twitter, for example, Luisa Munro, she's also a great historian now in living in Merida. She has her writing retreats, like creating community from different parts, like let's write those couple of 5 pages, like, just a little bit. And of course, then you separate yourselves, you go and have a great meal, or you go and walk in the park, well, when you can, and with all the safety measures. But what I think, for example, and if both of you can give us some advice, especially for the people who are in their PhD or undergrads, is like, like the 3 basics of writing in anthropology. Like, of course, Carole already mentioned like the 3 C's, but like from your own experience, from what you have learned, because when we were in school, we thought certain things were this way, or for example, I thought this way. Like, I should write this thesis like this way, and let me make an example. And I still use the example when I teach, especially when writing. When I was writing my BA thesis, and you can read that, is like, and Raul can help me with this, is like they always say like, you should start like this. The little town of X is in this latitude, this longitude, blah 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 blah, some things like that. And when I also wrote that way, but what I try to explain my students is like, look, do you know how to read coordinates just by by seeing them? Like, no, we need a map, we need a visual representation. So why, instead of using, very, straight jacket formal writing, why don't you start with some of your own experiences, or some of the experiences from, well, in histories from your archival research, or from your own ethnographic fieldwork experience. But that's, for example, the very few tip that I can go. So I hope that you can, like give us 3 or 4, like ideas of what's new on the road also, because things are changing so fast, especially after COVID-19. Like, things are going to change about the way we write, we do research, we understand each other scholarly, and also in the meantime when we have conferences, for example.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if I have 3 or 4 tips.
As many as you have.
I want to start actually with where you started, which is something that I think is still relatively new in the academy, which are writing workshops. I know that when I was a graduate student, those really did not exist. I remember we had things more like how to turn your dissertation into a book, which was a very, like hands-on kind of thing, versus, real workshops on ethnographic writing. And now I know, at least at the IIAES every year, there's more than one, right, workshop on ethnographic writing. And actually one of the best ones I've ever taken was on ethnographic poetry, and it was by Renato Rosaldo. And
I was going to say that.
Yeah, maybe 15 years ago, and it remains to this day like the single best thing I've ever done at the IIAES was be in that poetry workshop with him. But so now, I regularly do these for my students, either on my own or we bring in people. Kira Narayan, for example, Ruth Bahar, we have them come to campus and do ethnographic writing workshops. So for students, I would say sign up for as many of these as you can. Right. And sometimes it's not going to be on your campus. It's going to be on at a conference. Sometimes, however, especially now in COVID, right, pandemic times, these things are online. So it's, in some ways, it's also like seek out what you need and what you want. Or if you can't find it, create it. And going back to something Raul said, sometimes like you make an effort, when you try to create a writing group or a reading group, or I've had accountability groups, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, right? Like sometimes you try to get something up and running and it doesn't take hold, or it lasts longer than a couple of weeks. That's okay. It's like, don't be too discouraged by that. Like, keep searching for what it is you need. And sometimes like find the people who are willing to create it with you. So I think one of my best tips is, other than just read things that are well written and not just in academia, right? Read good literature, read poetry, right? Read writing that inspires you. But then also like find teachers and mentors and partners, right? Like for growing in your writing. So I guess maybe I have 2 tips. That's okay.
2 is good. No, thank you. You know, because I was thinking, for example, that I love science fiction at some point. And well, especially zombie post-apocalyptic dystopian futures. That's something I really, really like, and I read a lot about it. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with my, like 18th century indigenous economies, but at least, helps to distract and give you a lot of ideas. Also, thinking about other topics. For example, I read your book. I read Raul's articles. No, the things that is not about writing and the things about writing, like things about inspiring and things like, like this might help, or this might, I'm talking like, saying like for the people that are seeing us and listening to us, is like, because it's not easy at some point, like it's like baby steps sometimes, and sometimes you just have to let it go, Yeah. So Raul, what do you say? Well, you have a big blog about how to write so many things.
I think Carole has zeroed in on 2 very important ones: the read and the find mentors. And I wanted to add 2 of my own. One is writing in various media, and I write in index cards, and I write in my world-known everything notebook, right? Like, I have my notes, and I don't know, and then I write on the computer, and just the act of writing makes you, I don't know, it empowers me, right? Just, the notes that I've taken from our conversation, it's just so inspiring. It makes me think, wow, the next time I want to talk about writing, I will think about these things, right? Like, and I wanted to circle back because you first started asking us about writing ethnography and writing anthropology. And I wanted to circle back because an anthropologist, whose name I'm not going to repeat, said to me, ethnography is anthropology. It's what we do. And I think the freedom of accessing ethnography as a non-anthropologist has been extremely empowering in having conversations with anthropologists, right? Like, anthropologists, particularly of the new era, they keep inviting me to the AAAs, right? And I'm a political scientist and a human geographer who writes about public policy, but I get invited to the AAAs. And I can't think of a bigger compliment, right? Like, anthropologists wanting to converse with me on the stuff that I study. And that and ethnography has given me that. And writing ethnographies, writing about ethnography, and writing, in a way about the anthropological turn in ethnography. Also, I've written about the anthropology of policy, which is a topic that I'm particularly interested in. If you haven't had a chance to read it, Winifred Tate from Colby College recently published, I think in American in annual review of anthropology, on anthropology of policy. I think it's a fascinating area, and it's an area where I want to do more work, because how individuals make decisions. The public administration literature says, well, you should use the street level bureaucracy theories to do this. And I'm like, no, I could use anthropological approaches, and I could use ethnographic approaches. And I'm going to do it because now that I get invited to the AAAs, I feel open. And I don't know, I found that so fascinating that, I have so many wonderful conversations about anthropology, about ethnography with anthropologists, that I find that one of the disciplines that has opened the door to me the most. So I feel very grateful and very honored.
I like that. Welcome. You should feel welcome here, Raul. However, at the same time, the comment you started with, I hear that sometimes too, right? That there can be a defensiveness within anthropology, that ethnography is ours, right? Or we're the ones who do ethnography and the rest of you are doing it differently. So might not surprise you that I have thoughts on this. So I regularly teach a class on ethnography to non-anthropologists, for graduate students from around campus. And they come from all of our different, colleges and schools. I get them from the ed school, from journalism, from engineering, political science, geography, right? All of it, just everywhere. And what I explain to them is that for anthropologists, ethnography is not just a possible qualitative method, right? So it's not just on like a long list of methods that fall under qualitative, right? For anthropologists, ethnography is the method, right? In the sense of immersive participant observation, and then everything that kind of comes under that. And would be prefaced by ethnographic, such as, like an ethnographic interview or ethnographic fill in the blank. And so what I say to them, all of these graduate students from outside of anthropology, in anthropology, we don't have to make a case for ethnography. It's our starting point, right? Those of you who are coming to this seminar from other disciplines, you do, right, have to make a case for what ethnography is, why it matters to the research you're doing, and what it offers that can't be gained through some other method, right? And so in that sense, oftentimes I think people outside of anthropology are, sometimes the ethnography they're doing is slightly different, but it's a fitting into their disciplinary expectations and standards in a way different than we have to do in anthropology. And that really is true. However, it doesn't mean that the ethnography being done outside of anthropology isn't rich, deep, or even anthropological, right? Because some of it truly is. But it's different in that ethnography outside of anthropology is a possibility. Within anthropology, it's the ground of our knowledge and our work.
Oh, now you make it much more difficult, Carole.
I didn't mean to.
No, but it's great to think about it, because it is like also it takes us to the thing about writing. It's, for example, a designer. For example, I'm not a designer. I'm not even close to that. But now, as you just mentioned, you mentioned it in one of your comments. Like we have a lot of UX designers, doing or using ethnographic methods. I'm not saying they're doing ethnography. They're using ethnographic methods and rapid assessments and God knows what else, and maps and collaborative here and there. But there's a lot. I really would like to take couple of courses, like focus on that, especially one about probes. I really like cultural probes of what I have read. But the thing is, like, and I think you just say the word, the possibility of becoming ethnographic at some point, of course, with certain engagement, community engagement. How can I put it? It's like even if writing is empowering, as Raul said, like there's the other little push that we need to have from the community. Even if it's a focus group or people that you're giving them Amazon cards to buy books or whatever they want. There should be something there in the middle. Like can push you to write all these things. And especially that it's not a report actually, because a lot of people think that writing ethnography is like, oh, you just write your report filling all these the Murdoch like all the things and voila, you have an ethnography. It's like no wait, like we have to give a couple of steps back, because it's not filling spaces of a list of things that you need to see, because it is, as Raul, I remember he had a tweet a couple of days ago, or was yesterday. He's like, you have to have a question. Always have to have a question and answering the best way you can. And if you can't, keep a couple of steps backwards, and then engage yourself and then start writing. That doesn't mean that writing is not bad or is not useless. Is like taking all these elements and rewrite or build from what you have. Also keeping that. And I love that Raul has his cards. I have my own notebook here. I love it. And yeah, for example, I learned, for example, from my advisor, mi jefecito, back in the day when he was in the archive, Eric Van Jonk used his card files, like he was able to bring the computer. He's like, no, I like the writing because I can make my notes. There's something about technology that doesn't, is not a transfer of the touch of the paper and writing with your own idea. So that gives an extra dimension when we're writing. Well, and I'm saying anthropology also, no? But anyway, I'm just going to make a quick announcement, and we can continue with this, and also closing. Because if someone has some questions, those people who are listening to us, please jump into the conversation. All comments are welcome. So that was my announcement. So I hope that someone send us some comments. No worries. If not, there's tons of things to read this week. There's Carole's book, Raul's blog, and also Carole, just and this is a question because it was not the Flash, it was the Writing Anthropology. Previous the book, it was in what it was called the blog, Savage Minds. Now it's Androdendum, right? No,
correct.
Yes, and it's still there. I don't know if it's still there.
It's still there, yes. No, I was a blogger, core blogger on Savage Minds for, I forget now, 6 or 7 years. So
really?
There's many posts to read if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But I think you're right. I love how you each held up. I don't have behind me I could hold up things. I think there's many ways about being curious, many ways to be curious about the world. And writing is one way. I always have some form of paper or pen like on my body. Like I always am able to write something because that matters to me. Like I always have a pen. I also always have chocolate, which is a separate conversation, but I'm always able to write something down because that's one of the ways that I experience the world, right, is through writing. And actually, Raul, when I was a graduate student, everything I did was on note cards. And to this day, one of my favorite ways to give a talk is actually to speak from note cards, not from a written paper, but actually it's a way, sometimes you do need to read a lecture, right, in that academic sense, but actually speaking from note cards is one of my favorite ways to actually truly connect with an audience, right, and to be present in a different way. But that writing, that ability to write, like I always have a notebook or some form of paper and a pen with me. And that's, I guess, one of those signs of being a writer, of being someone who encounters the world and processes it and thinks about it and is in it, right, through the writing.
Absolutely. And you talked about two things, and one is very anthropological, which is ritual and process. Two things that I think are worth emphasizing for the audience and for us, because my ritual in the morning is the same. Like I wake up, brush my teeth, wash my face, start my computer, and then start writing. And if I don't write, then I read an article, and then I highlight it, and then I write in the cards. So that's part of my ritual, and that ritual generates words for me. It really does. It's incredible. And on process, I agree. I also have always paper on me, but this is interesting because I have found these notes that I've taken from this conversation that Carole and I were having and that you were facilitating, Ricardo, just so insightful, right? Like, so now I have stuff to write more, right? Like I've written, a couple of words about, the basics of writing anthropology and ethnography for non-anthropologists, and that just gives me more food. And that's one thing that I should tell my students, right? Like, listen to an engaging lecture or converse with someone, have a conversation with someone. If you're stuck, if you're blocked with your writing, tell someone, right? Like, I'm writing my thesis. My thesis is an ethnography of hospital workers under COVID, and I'm blocked. Okay. And then the interlocutor can say, tell me about it. Well, I'm concerned about the nurses, and they're under so much stress and so on. And I've witnessed this and I've witnessed that. And as you say that is captured. And that can be captured in a voice note or in a notebook and so on. I actually published in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods a piece on using your field notes as fodder for writing, and I think I think fieldwork notebooks are so private, but I always used to go over my students and my research assistants, because I was like, you need a process to write your fieldwork notebook in a way that makes sense to you, but I, as your supervisor, should be able to help you use it to write. So yeah, process and ritual are both super important in writing, I think.
I'm only going to make, I'm sorry, Carol, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say just one very quick thing about Raul's rituals, because his ritual starts at 4 o'clock in the morning, just so everyone knows that he is a very early bird. And I only wanted to add just one more thing about the dimension about, inspiration and engagement, because both of you are, filling me with this. I really want to, fix my computer and start writing things. But, it's one thing that I learned, for example, from kids, for example, from very good friends' kids, is that, for example, children's book about discovering the world. All these little techniques, like let's collect rocks or let's collect stuff while, giving a stroll in the street. Like you see a stone, you see a leaf, and then you start writing a very short story, or just start imagining things. And reading those kind of things, at least helped me, to understand a lot about my own writing. Well, anyway.
Okay, I have lots of thoughts. Actually, can you all hear me? Am I connected still?
Yes, we suddenly went. Just
we haven't talked about stories and storytelling, but that's actually a key component of what I do and argue, right? That ethnography is about telling stories. Put that to the side for now. I want to say that getting up at 4 a.m. is one thing I've only done once in my life. When I was pregnant with my daughter, I would get up at maybe not 4, maybe 4:30, and right before the rest of the family woke up. So for all the people listening, I also want to say, your writing rhythms might also change as your life course changes. In addition to being a professor, I'm also a mother. And the writing I did, my writing times before I became a mother were different than my writing times when my children were very small. They're now both teenagers. And so now I've moved into a different stage, right? And my son is getting ready to go to college, which I think will now open up a new type of writing space for me. So just also marking ourselves, right, back to that human being, individuals in the world, and what our possibilities are as we move through, right, kind of our own lives. I see a couple comments over on my right, and to those who are writing the comments, thank you so much. We don't have the ability to respond to them, as far as I can tell. But I wanted
I can put them here. I'm sorry. I can put them. I was just waiting a little bit.
It's all right.
Pleasure.
So, Soraya, hello. I want to say thank you for that lovely comment. And I get asked this question a lot. The question you put down below, where your students say it's hard to experiment during the graduate years. That absolutely is the case at many universities. And so I think those of us on this call who are faculty members and who are committed to thinking about writing, including, writing as not something that's stable, but as something we're constantly creating, is to give your students permission, right, to experiment with voice, with structure, with form, right, and to model for them how to do it and to teach writing that does it. So students who are listening, find those not just mentors, but also committee members who are going to allow you, to have the act of writing, right, the craft of writing to be part of your scholarship. Right. So I know, I try to do that with my students, but perhaps not everyone does. Right. So it can be possible. But the thing is making sure you have a committee who is going to support you, but also nurture you, I think, in doing this. Victoria, I see a question about favorite ethnographies. I just want to share 2 that were just published, because this is something I teach ethnographies all the time. Every week, feel like I'm reading a new ethnography with my students, and 2 that have come out in the last year that I think are both just beautifully rendered. One is by Saiba Varma. It's published by Duke University Press, and it's called The Occupied Clinic. It's about Kashmir, and it's a stunning book, deeply haunting and beautifully written. The second is by Sienna Craig, and it's from University of Washington Press, and it's called The Ends of Kinship. And in it, she takes 20 years of ethnographic research. And in her chapter, she alternates ethnographic nonfiction with ethnographic fiction. And so in addition to being about writing genre, it's about the type of truth, right, that ethnography can produce. And both of them are just, of two books I've read in the last year that have surprised me, those are the two that immediately come to mind for me.
So I've been reading a metric ton of ethnographies lately from anthropologists and sociologists, and I don't think I can say one, because I can give you several ones, right? Like Adia Benton on Sierra Leone, published by University of Minnesota Press. Rebecca Martinez, who won an award on cervical cancer hospitals in Venezuela. Forrest Stewart's, both his books are incredible. Ballad of the Bullet is fantastic. Fascinating work. Ashley Mears with her, Pricing Beauty. She became a model to do an ethnography of the modeling industry, and her latest book, Very Important People, as well. But I want to say one that just caught me off guard was Robin Nagel's Ethnography of the Sanitation System. And I need to remember the title because I don't have it here with me. It's not right behind me. Normally my waste books are here, but I have her book in my other house. But she's such an incredible writer. And she's an anthropologist, and she's incredible. There were at points when I read her book, Picking Up. It's called Picking Up. And it's about sanitation, the life of the sanitation workers in the city of New York City. There were times when I had to stop and breathe. Like, seriously, it was like, it just caught me off guard, and I was like, oh my God, I have no breath. I can't breathe right now. And I had to take some time to just, catch my breath and then continue reading. And I think that is that words can do that to your body is just incredible. And I have to say, I had the same effect with your introduction to writing anthropology, Carole. There were points where I was like, okay, somebody give me just a minute. I need to process. And it's probably the one chapter where I come back to just when I need like a little jolt of energy when I'm writing.
Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah, well, I only want just to add one thing to Victoria's question is, like, for example, no one asked me, but for example, even historical novels. For example, I really enjoy. Well, I also enjoy ethnography, but one historical novel that is for a young audience that is called Fever 1793. That written by Laurie Halse Anderson, that is actually about the yellow fever, I think, in Philadelphia. She writes, of course, for a young audience, but the intersection of so many things. Now, Raul mentioned sanitation, the epidemic, a very young girl, in charge from one day and another, how to deal with so many things. Things about race and medicine and the perception of things, and of course, well, it's for a specific audience, but believe me, I learned so much from that book. Well, for all books, but especially that one is like yeah, I think that here is the things that I need to learn about very 18th century sanitation cordons or quarantines or God knows what else. But anyway, Victoria says thank you both, and also a happy face. No, thank you for following us, Soraya, also. So unfortunately, we need to start closing. I wish we could stay here, but both Raul and Carole, they also have things to do. And well, if you would like to make some closing remarks, both of you, I know, like both of you are in ethnography, writing, scholarly publishing, but also engage with your own communities, not only anthropologists and of course your students. So please, if you would like to share with us some final remarks or something, like as Raul said, like the jolt, I said el empujón, a little.
I'll start, and then I'll let Carole close. I'd like to encourage again, and this is something that I'd like to encourage you to think also of writing as generosity. Cite generously, cite profusely, cite not just white old men, cite intersectionally, write in a way that involves First Nations, disabled scholars, contingent scholars, queer scholars, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, scholars from the global north, scholars from the global south. Like, it make of your writing an enterprise that builds community and that builds a better society and a better academia. That's what I would say. See your writing as this sort of medium to create a better world for us.
I agree entirely. So while fully endorsing that, kind of adding to it, to think of writing as a responsibility, right? As a type of ethical practice. So again, it's not just a task or a component of what we do, but it's something into which we have to really put both heart and mind, right? And a sense of responsibility for these words we're putting out into the world. The second thing that I guess the third, if we Rose first, and then maybe this could be the closing one, is for everyone who's listening. But I guess perhaps especially for those of you who are still training, who are still graduate students, is don't think of what you're doing as contributing to a literature. You are creating it, right? All of us who are here together, scholarship doesn't exist independent of us. We are the ones who make it, right? And so to do it in the most generous, generative, ethical, responsible, loving, and rigorous, right, way is what we are creating together, not just contributing passively to something that exists, outside of us. It is of our creation, and to do it, as best we possibly can. So.
Híjole, wow, thank you both for this, for all the chat, but this too, I like both, like not being passive when writing, I have never heard that, so thank you, Carole. And also thank you, Raul, for saying, like, being generous about citation, about citing our colleagues, especially from the Global South, because I confess that hopefully we will have colleagues who are, showing the lack of cites or citations from the women Black anthropological communities, like why there's all this balance. And I don't even want to think what's going on in Latin America, for example, and also from, the scholarly production from indigenous communities. So, well, thank you both, Carole, Raul. I made a lot of notes. Sorry, this has been a great conversation. I have learned a lot, and I hope that the people who are listening to us and while viewing us enjoy the talk. Thank you, Aline. Thank you, Soraya. We're seeing you here. Sorry, there's Aline Rochedo and Soraya Fleischer. I hope that it's well pronounced. So no, thank you for following us. Before I make my final remarks, I only have to do a commercial, very brief. Now, these IUAES conversations, well, here it says conversación. Sorry, I'm the designer, and sometimes I forget to change the logos. The Congress is going to be in November. The call for papers is going to be soon open for everyone, and it will be distributed all over the place, from the IUAES social media, WOW social media, World Council of Anthropological Associations, and of course from the Mexican associations, because this technically was going to be it was going to be in Mexico, but the pandemic obliged the organizing committee to make it online. But we're going to have the same experience, and we're hoping to have this vibrant experience as the same energy and like the engagement of these two wonderful scholars. So we will keep everyone posted about the call for papers. This is it. The call for papers is coming. Yes, I also participate with the symposium, but I'm not going to tell you because that's a personal commercial. So this is it. So I just want to thank Carole McGranahan and Raul Pacheco-Vega, just, to summarize, like, it is like, wow. One of the both things is like, be generous with your colleagues, not only from your field, anthropology or history, but everyone who can contribute to your own writing. And as Carole mentioned, is like not being passive. We are creating, constructing, and also it's an ethical component of our own disciplines. And I'm talking social sciences disciplines in general, especially, of course, anthropology. So, well, I invite everyone, to see Raul Pacheco-Vega's blog. He has lots of ideas. He has a lot of things. And of course, Carole's blog and the book, and following also and actually, yeah, there's the book. Thank you, Raul. To follow these two wonderful scholars, it's not only about inspiration, but also, to start creating, I'm going to say, a global discussion about how we write, not only anthropology, ethnography, and especially in the social sciences. So I want to thank you both for being with us. I want to thank the people who has been watching us. This is being recorded, so you can watch it later, no problem. And of course, if you need any recommendations, feel free to write Raul or Carole, or write to the IUAES Congress, and we will be happy to put you in contact with both scholars, or with any other scholars that you would like to get involved. If we can get in contact. So thank you both. Just Carole, Raul, please stay with me while I, end the broadcast. And well, thank you. Have a great evening for those who are in the US, those who are in Central Mexico. I'm in Mexico City, and see you everyone, hopefully next week, on 2 weeks, and of course during the Congress. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, everyone.